We'll start with the first question. It's a big one. It's a broad one. Are the vaccines safe?
I can start the discussion on that topic. Okay, so in a word, you could say it's safe, but what do we mean by that? So just to clarify what this looks like, the whole process for developing a vaccine to the point where you have a product you can actually distribute is a very rigorous process. And a huge part of that process is to make sure that you have assurances of safety all along the way. So without going into very, very fine details, you have some critical stages of development, and a lot of that work gets done up front because you have to get to a point where you can actually progress from the lab bench to the point where you have something that you can actually inject into a human. So typically, I'll just simplify this as much as I can because it starts way back in the process from the point where you start looking at the materials you want to have included in the formulation. You have to look at obviously for vaccines, you're talking about sterile injectables. So that by itself confers some huge requirements around that confer safety on the vaccine. If you're saying that your product is sterile, that's a huge impact on safety of the product. Then you have to go through clinical stages of study. And the first clinical stage 1, there is a lot of work done to start demonstrating safety. And for one thing, not very many participants are involved at that stage. But some of the objectives there is to look at the dose tolerance, for example, to see how much dose a person can tolerate. Then as you progress through to phase 2 and phase 3, you're looking at more evidence for safety. In the case of the 2 first vaccines that we have approved on the emergency use, the Pfizer vaccine was the safety and efficacy was studied on the phase 2-3 clinical study, and the Moderna was studied on the phase 3 study. So in the case of the Pfizer study, there were about 43,000 participants in that phase 2-3 clinical study, where they looked at both safety and efficacy. And looking at the safety aspects of the study, this was a placebo-controlled study where you had half of the participants getting the vaccine component and the other half getting the placebo. So the objective is to look at the different, what was the results of the study in terms of any type of adverse events that showed up either through the vaccine part of the study or the placebo start. And in general, what we can say for Pfizer was that there were not very many serious adverse events. And most of the adverse reporting was, and by the way, let me just go back and highlight a couple of things because this is primarily a Black audience concern. There were Black participants in this study. In the case of Pfizer, I think it was about 10%. It's either 10 or 9%, but one of the groups was 10 and the other one was 9. So in any case, there was Black representation in terms of assessing safety. So primarily, the adverse events were minor events such as fatigue, that sort of thing, and maybe some more systemic ones such as temperature, fevers, and so on. There were a few serious adverse events, but those were associated with allergenic responses, and I think there were a couple of anaphylactic ones. But it's also important to note that in this Pfizer study, there were a couple of I think 2 or 3 deaths, but none of them were actually vaccine related. There was no evidence that there was any reactogenicity. I think one was a cardiac arrest, and the other one one of them was, I think, it wasn't. There was nothing that was related to the vaccine. And in the placebo part of the study, there were, I think, 4 deaths, and again, none of these were vaccine related. So the evidence from the Pfizer study was pretty clear that based on this particular study, the phase 2-3 study, which we're using as our index study, the vaccines were safe. And in the case of Moderna, they had a slightly smaller study. I think it was around 30,000 participants, again, placebo-controlled, and similar results where you had no indication of safety issues either in the vaccine group or in the placebo group. So that's a very, very compressed explanation of the safety aspects of the vaccine. And then, of course, post the clinical studies that Pfizer and Moderna executed, we have been distributing the vaccines on the emergency use authorization. And of course, I mean, by this started back, I guess, the beginning of the year, and at this point, there's a huge number of people who have had the vaccine and are being monitored, and all of the vaccines that are distributed are monitored for follow-up. And so there's reporting that comes back into various databases in Canada, US, and in terms of the US, the number is well over 100 million by now. And so it's pretty easy to go and check and look at what the profiles are for people, the safety profiles are for people who have received the vaccines. And the profiles are still fairly consistent up to the last time I looked at them. So there's no indication of any reactogenicity other than the ones that we've talked about before. Other than the ones that were highlighted for a little while was what were associated with anaphylaxis. And the concern there was that it could possibly be linked to one component of the vaccine. And both Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine have similar components. They may be a little bit different in terms of their physical attributes, but it's both related to a material called polyethylene glycol, which is fairly common throughout the drug industry. It's used in cosmetics. It's used fairly widely, and I guess if you have an allergic response to it, then it may be a concern. But the only concern so far that we've identified is this particular one. And it's considered to be a rare event anyway. So that's kind of a very quick summary of the safety discussion. But you know, the vaccines there's ongoing monitoring of the participants in the clinical study, except that I'm not sure if they're still monitoring the ones who received the placebo, because obviously there are ethical considerations to continue those people who received the placebo doses on without giving them the actual vaccine, because obviously you know that the demonstration of efficacy was extremely good for both of those two vaccines. So I know there are some discussions about what happened to those people. I don't know the results of that though. So that's a very quick summary, and you know, if anybody wants to add to it, please feel free.
No, I agree with 100%, 200% with what Trevor has indicated. I will just make a couple of very brief points. It's in my clinical practice of infectious diseases, it's very frequently that we encounter situations where we have to counsel families about vaccines and their safety. And in that regard, I often, within my own mind, have a scale that I, have like from 1 to 10, where 1 would be a terribly toxic and unsafe vaccine, and 10 would be the perfect vaccine. And the pediatric vaccines now that we use to prevent things like meningitis and pneumonias, they're really close to a 10. They're really good. These vaccines, particularly the ones that came out first, are really close to a 10. And Trevor has really articulated that. They're really up there. They're in the 8 to 10 zone, which would make them among the safest vaccines that have ever been made. Now, Trevor has highlighted a very important phase of the process, and that is the post-marketing phase, where one administers a vaccine and one puts in place surveillance mechanisms to pick up signals. Those signals are rare. By definition, they're rare because you're looking at picking up signals that occur among millions of doses of vaccines being administered. And so when those signals happen, then one looks more closely to see whether or not they're really true signals that are related to the vaccines. And so overall, we're looking at very safe products.